This video focuses on the consequences of coups d'état in the world, within the period 1980 to 2023. In the last 4 decades, more than 100 coups d'état have shaken the world, from Latin America to Africa, from Southeast Asia to the Middle East. These are not just stories of generals and soldiers seizing power, but of countries derailed, economies shattered, and dreams deferred. This is the untold story of power grabs that led to collapse, the hidden cost of coups d'état, from 1980 to 2023. What causes them? What happens after the dust settles? And most importantly, can they be prevented? What is a coups d'état? A coups d'état, or simply a coup, is the sudden, illegal overthrow of a government, typically by a small group, often from the military or elite class. Unlike revolutions led by the masses, coups usually happen in hours or days. They're fast. They're forceful. And they often claim to restore order, while plunging nations into decades of chaos. According to the Global Instances of Coups dataset, Africa accounts for more than half of all successful coups since 1950. But Latin America, Asia, and even parts of Europe have not been spared. It's more about lawlessness. A coups d'état is not just a political event, it's a crime against the nation. It dismantles constitutional order, silences the will of the people, and installs power through fear, not consent. In many cases, coups bring human rights violations, economic collapse, and decades of military dictatorship. They rob nations of progress and citizens of their voice. To tolerate a coup is to normalize lawlessness at the highest level of government. And for that reason, every coup should be seen, and punished, as a crime against democracy itself. From Asia to Africa to America to Europe and the entire globe, there are laws protecting the regions from coups d'état. From history. Bolivia, July 17, 1980, Garcia Meza overthrows Lydia Guyler. Motive: prevent a left-wing democratic government under Hernan Siles Zuazo from taking power. Here, Garcia Meza's regime became notorious for human rights abuses and drug trafficking. It delayed Bolivia's return to democracy and isolated the country internationally. Turkey, September 12, 1980, military coup led by Kenan Evren. Motive: widespread political violence between right and left-wing factions, economic instability, and weak civilian leadership. Here, the military suspended parliament, rewrote the constitution, and suppressed dissent. Thousands were arrested or tortured. It restored stability short-term but deepened mistrust in democratic institutions. Liberia, April 12, 1980, Samuel Doe ousts President Tolbert. Motive: ethnic resentment, class tensions, and widespread poverty under Americo-Liberian elite rule. Here, marked the end of over a century of Americo-Liberian dominance. However, Doe's regime became authoritarian and corrupt, leading to civil unrest and eventually Liberia's civil war. Guinea-Bissau, 1980, Vieira deposes the government. Motive: power struggle within the ruling party. João Bernardo Vieira took advantage of military influence. Impact: initiated 2 decades of political instability. Vieira would remain in and out of power, with Guinea-Bissau struggling with weak governance and military interference. Suriname, 1980, Sergeant Desi Bouterse leads coup. Motive: discontent within the army over poor conditions, corruption, and weak civilian leadership. Here, Bouterse's regime became dictatorial, notably responsible for the December murders. Suriname entered a long period of military dominance and human rights violations. Upper Volta, now Burkina Faso, November 25, 1980, Zerbo removes Lamazana. Motive: political gridlock, economic crisis, and dissatisfaction with democratic experiments. Impact: began a cycle of successive coups, leading to long-term instability. The country underwent multiple regime changes in the following years until a semblance of stability was reached. Guatemala, March 23, 1982, Rios Montt seizes power. Motive: overthrow a corrupt regime and halt alleged election fraud. Here, Montt's regime became one of the bloodiest during the Civil War. Thousands of indigenous people were massacred in counterinsurgency operations. This led to international condemnation and deepened civil unrest. Bangladesh, March 24, 1982, General Ershad ousts President Sattar. Motive: political instability, weak governance, and the military's desire to restore order. Here, Ershad ruled as a military dictator for nearly a decade, suppressing dissent and facing mass protests. Eventually, this led to a return to civilian rule in 1990. Upper Volta, now Burkina Faso, November 7, 1982, Ouedraogo overthrows Zerbo. Motive: dissatisfaction with Colonel Zerbo's military leadership and promises of reform. Here, marked the start of recurring coups. Ouedraogo's rule was short-lived, paving the way for Thomas Sankara's iconic revolution in 1983. Mauritania, December 12, 1984, Taya overthrows Haidala. Motive: Haidala's growing isolationism, unpopular policies, and internal political tensions. Here, Taya ruled for 2 decades, providing relative stability but suppressing opposition and facing accusations of human rights abuses. Guinea, August 4, 1983, Thomas Sankara takes over, Burkina Faso. Motive: revolutionary ideals, anti-imperialism, and frustration with corrupt elites. Here, Sankara launched sweeping reforms in health, women's rights, and education. He inspired many across Africa before being assassinated in a 1987 coup. Guinea, December 12, 1984, Lansana Conté replaces Biavogi. Motive: power vacuum after President Touré's death. The military seized the opportunity. Here, Conté ruled for 24 years. Initially welcomed, his regime later became known for repression, corruption, and economic decline. Sudan, April 6, 1985, swore Al-Dahab removes President Nameri. Motive: mounting civil unrest, economic hardship, and opposition to Nameri's imposition of Islamic law in a multi-religious country. Here, the military temporarily handed over power to a civilian government. However, Sudan entered a cycle of instability that would continue for decades. Nigeria, August 27, 1985, General Ibrahim Babangida overthrows General Muhammadu Buhari. Motive: discontent within the military over Buhari's authoritarianism and strict economic policies. Here, Babangida's regime introduced economic liberalization but was marked by corruption and annulled elections, eventually leading to further military rule and political crises. Tunisia, November–December 1987, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali takes over from President Habib Bourguiba. Motive: Bourguiba was aging and seen as mentally unfit to lead. Elites feared instability. Here, Ben Ali promised democratic reforms but later established a police state. He remained in power until the Arab Spring forced his ouster in 2011. Burkina Faso, October 15, 1987, Blaise Compaoré assassinates Thomas Sankara. Motive: internal disagreements over Sankara's radical policies and anti-imperialist stance. Foreign interests may have supported the coup. Here, Sankara's revolutionary reforms were reversed. Compaoré ruled for 27 years, during which Burkina Faso saw economic shifts but growing repression. Fiji, May 14, 1987, Lieutenant Colonel Sitiveni Rabuka leads a coup d'état. Motive: reaction to the election of a government dominated by ethnic Indo-Fijians, seen as a threat by indigenous Fijian elites. Here, Fiji was plunged into political and ethnic tensions. It became a republic, was suspended from the Commonwealth, and experienced multiple future coups. Mali, March 26, 1991, Traoré removed in a coup led by Amadou Toumani Touré. Motive: growing protests against authoritarian rule, economic hardship, and military repression of student movements. Here, the transition to democratic government took place. Touré handed power to civilians, and Mali held its first multi-party elections, making it a model for peaceful democratic transition in West Africa, until later coups reversed the progress. Lesotho, April 1991, Ramima led a military takeover. Motive: internal military power struggle and dissatisfaction with the previous military council. This led to constitutional reforms and a transition to democracy by 1993. However, military influence lingered and would spark future instability. Algeria, January 1992, military cancels elections. Motive: the Islamic Salvation Front (FIS) was poised to win national elections. The military intervened to prevent an Islamist government. This triggered the Algerian Civil War, lasting over a decade with more than 150,000 deaths. Marked a turning point in the fight between secular and Islamist forces in the region. Peru, April 5, 1992, President Alberto Fujimori dissolves Congress in a self-coup. Motive: Fujimori claimed Congress was blocking his reforms and anti-terrorism measures. Here, President Alberto Fujimori consolidated power and gained public support briefly, but his regime later collapsed in corruption scandals. The move undermined democratic institutions and inspired similar tactics across Latin America. Sierra Leone, April 29, 1992, Valentine Strasser seizes power. Motive: frustration with the mismanagement of the civil war and military neglect by the government. Here, installed the world's youngest head of state, aged 25. The junta failed to bring peace, and civil war escalated. Sierra Leone fell deeper into conflict and humanitarian crisis. The Gambia, July 22, 1994, Yahya Jammeh overthrows President Jawara. Motive: discontent within the military over low pay, lack of promotions, and perceptions of government corruption. Here, Jammeh ruled for 22 years, marked by authoritarianism, human rights abuses, and fear. The Gambia became isolated until his eventual ousting in 2017. Burundi, July 25, 1996, Pierre Buyoya seizes power. Motive: ethnic violence between Hutus and Tutsis escalated after the assassination of President Dede in 1993. Buyoya claimed to intervene to stop the bloodshed. Though Pierre Buyoya restored some order, civil war continued. Peace talks eventually led to the Arusha Accords, paving the way for Burundi's democratic transition in the 2000s. Niger, January 27, 1996, Ibrahim Bair-Mainasara overthrows President Mahamadou Ousmane. Motive: political gridlock and instability due to power struggles between the president and parliament. Here, Bair's rule was authoritarian and marked by electoral fraud. He was assassinated in 1999 during another coup. Niger, April 9, 1999, Dauda Malam Wank takes power after the assassination of Bair-Mainasara. Motive: response to political crisis and assassination of the sitting president. Here, Wank organized elections and handed over power peacefully, helping restore democratic governance. Mauritania, August 6, 2005, Colonel Eli Ould Mohamed Val overthrows Taya. Motive: accusations of authoritarianism, nepotism, and foreign policy misalignment. Here, Val led a peaceful transition back to civilian rule and was praised for organizing democratic elections in 2007. Mauritania, August 6, 2008, Mohamed Ould Abdelaziz overthrows President Abdallahi. Motive: tensions between the president and military leadership over reform policies. Here, Aziz solidified power through elections but was criticized for suppressing dissent. The coup undermined previous democratic progress. Central African Republic, March 15, 2003, François Bozizé overthrows President Patas. Motive: accusations of corruption, weak leadership, and instability under Patas. Here, Bozizé ruled until 2013. His tenure saw some order restored, but later elections were disputed, leading to further coups and ongoing conflict. Mauritania, July 16, 2003, attempted coup, failed coup against President Maouya Ould Sid Ahmed Taya. Motive: discontent over Taya's increasingly autocratic rule and ties with Israel. The coup failed, but it exposed cracks in the military's loyalty and set the stage for later successful coups. Mali, March 21, 2012, Captain Amadou Sanogo overthrows President Amadou Toumani Touré. Motive: anger over the government's failure to suppress Tuareg and Islamist insurgencies in northern Mali, and frustration within the military over poor equipment and leadership. Here, the coup created a power vacuum that allowed Islamist militants to capture northern Mali. It triggered foreign intervention, France's Operation Serval, and prolonged instability. Egypt, July 3, 2013, military led by General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi removes President Mohamed Morsi. Motive: mass protests against Morsi's governance and fears he was consolidating power under the Muslim Brotherhood. This ended Egypt's brief experiment with Islamic democracy. This led to a military-backed government under el-Sisi marked by authoritarianism, mass arrests, and suppression of dissent. Sudan, April 11, 2019, military removes President Omar al-Bashir after 30 years in power. Motive: widespread protests due to economic hardship, corruption, and decades of authoritarian rule. This was initially seen as a people-powered victory, but the military retained significant power. Continued clashes between military and civilian factions delayed the democratic transition. Mali, August 18, 2020, President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta overthrown. Motive: public outrage over corruption, failure to end violence in the north, and contested parliamentary elections. Here, the military formed the National Committee for the Salvation of the People, CNSP. The country entered a transition phase but remained unstable. Mali, May 24, 2021, Colonel Assimi Goïta removes interim President Ba-Ndo. Motive: tensions between civilian transitional leaders and military figures over cabinet appointments and control of the government. The military accused Ndo and his prime minister of trying to sabotage the transition. Colonel Goïta declared himself president. This deepened international isolation led to ECOWAS sanctions and caused a pivot toward Russian support, including the Wagner Group. Mali's democratic timeline stalled. Guinea, September 5, 2021, Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya ousts President Alpha Condé. Motive: Condé amended the constitution in 2020 to secure a controversial third term, sparking public protests and military resentment. The coup was framed as a response to authoritarianism and economic mismanagement. This led to Condé detention. The military dissolved institutions and promised a transition. However, Guinea saw rising authoritarianism under the junta, regional tension with ECOWAS, and delays in returning to civilian rule. Burkina Faso, January 23, 2022, President Roch-Marc Kaboré was removed by the military, led by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. Motive: rising jihadist violence, public anger over the government's failure to address insecurity, and declining trust in democratic leadership. Here, the military promised a return to stability but struggled to contain insurgencies. Political unrest persisted. Burkina Faso, September 30, 2022, Damiba ousted by Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Motive: continued terrorist attacks and the perceived failure of Damiba to deliver on security promises. This led to further military control under Traoré. The country deepened its break with Western allies and increased cooperation with Russia and other alternative partners. Niger, July 26, 2023, President Mohamed Bazoum was overthrown by General Abdourahmane Tiani. Motive: dissatisfaction within the presidential guard, resentment of Bazoum's leadership style, and growing nationalist rhetoric. This led to widespread condemnation, suspension from ECOWAS, and threat of regional military intervention. Shifted Niger's foreign policy away from traditional Western partners. Gabon, August 30, 2023, President Ali Bongo ousted by General Brice Oligui Nguema. Motive: allegations of election rigging in Bongo's third-term win and public fatigue with the Bongo family's long-standing rule, since 1967. Here, the military coup received some public support. Promised democratic reforms, but observers remained cautious about true change. Deduction from the subject. Regions like West Africa, Latin America, and parts of South Asia are marked with persistent coups, while other regions like the US, UK, and Western Europe are known for coup resistance. The factors responsible for persistent coups in these regions are: weak institutions. Countries with fragile judicial systems, politicized security forces, and weak checks and balances are more vulnerable to military takeovers. Civil-military imbalance. In many coup-prone regions, the military holds disproportionate power and can act as an arbiter in political disputes, e.g., Mali, Burkina Faso, Pakistan. Poor governance and corruption. Coups often follow widespread frustration with corrupt or ineffective civilian governments. Discontent in places like Guinea and Sudan made it easier for military factions to gain popular support. Electoral manipulation. In cases where leaders overstayed their mandates or rigged elections, e.g., Guinea's Condé or Gabon's Bongo, coups were sometimes framed as resets. Economic crisis and inequality. Economic hardship, unemployment, and lack of development exacerbate public frustration, fueling coups as supposed solutions. Foreign influence, Cold War rivalries, and now regional and international power plays, e.g., Russia, France, ECOWAS, AU, have at times enabled or tolerated coups. Legacy of colonial rule. Post-independent states with arbitrarily drawn borders, ethnic divisions, and no strong democratic tradition have struggled to consolidate stable governance. The factors that aid some countries' resistance to coups are: strong democratic institutions, regular, transparent elections, a free press, and a functioning judiciary create accountability without violence. Civilian control of the military. In democracies, the military is strictly apolitical and subordinate to elected leaders. Economic stability and development. Prosperity reduces the appeal of radical changes and militarized solutions to political problems. Public norms and political culture. Citizens in stable democracies expect peaceful transitions of power and reject extra-legal takeovers. Historical precedent. Countries that have not experienced coups in modern times tend to maintain traditions of constitutional rule, reinforcing legitimacy. In summary, persistent coups occur where institutions are weak, militaries are politicized, and civilians are disillusioned. In contrast, regions with strong democracies, rule of law, and civilian supremacy remain largely immune to coups. Coup poses severe dangers to citizens, and these include loss of life and injuries, mass arrests and detentions, suppression of freedoms, displacement and fear, as well as psychological trauma. It poses severe dangers to nations, and these include breakdown of constitutional order, instability and cycles of violence, economic collapse and investor flight, loss of international legitimacy, delayed or derailed development, militarization of politics. It also poses dangers to the community, and these include regional destabilization, erosion of democratic norms worldwide, refugee flows and humanitarian strain, increased geopolitical tensions, as well as obstruction of peacekeeping and diplomacy. This is to emphasize that coup is a crime to humanity, the nation, and the globe. There is no justification for it, and no matter how awful a leader is, the constitutional provisions, through the effective participation of citizens, will replace such leader through their democratic powers. The parties, the initiator of the coup and the overthrown, have never been friends after a successful coup attempt, that is, if one party ever stays alive. To be true to the intention of restoring order, where there is a severe anarchy, the evidence of no blood shared and prompt transition to civil rule through democratic processes is the conviction. Therefore, power gained through a coup d'état brings collapse to the citizenry, nation, and partly to the global communities. Additional information. Where a country genuinely needs assistance to avoid the occurrence of a coup in its territory, the following bodies could be consulted. A. Organizations for Governance Strengthening and Rule of Law. 1. United Nations Development Programme, UNDP. 2. International IDEA. 3. National Democratic Institute, NDI. Their functions are to provide democracy-building programs, to train judicial institutions to uphold the constitutional order, to assist in anti-corruption reforms and election transparency. B. Organizations for military professionalism and civil-military relations. 1. United States Institute of Peace, USIP. 2. Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center. 3. Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, DCAF. Their functions are to help reform national defense institutions, to train officers in respect for civilian authority, to advise on non-politicization of armed forces. C. Organizations for regional cooperation and legal frameworks. 1. African Union, AU. 2. Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. 3. European Union, EU. Their functions are to enforce zero-tolerance policies on unconstitutional changes of government, to sanction coup leaders and freeze international cooperation, to deploy diplomatic missions to restore constitutional order. D. Organizations for early warning systems and crisis response. 1. Crisis Group. 2. Safer World. 3. UN Peacebuilding Fund. Their functions are to monitor political instability indicators, to support dialogue and mediation before violence erupts, to fund resilience programs for fragile democracies. E. Organizations for education, media, and civic awareness. 1. Open Society Foundations. 2. Transparency International. 3. BBC Media Action. Their functions are to educate citizens on the danger of military takeovers, to promote free and responsible media, to fund civic technology tools for watchdog accountability,